Hi, hello everyone. My name is Haziel and today we're going to talk about curves. In the first tutorial I ever made, I talked about how often I use SVGs, and that's basically curves, but that I imported from another software. Today we're going to talk about curves that are native to Blender. And let's start by mentioning the previous tutorial and talk about a curve that you can just draw and then bevel. So you can add curve and then Bezier, and you'll most often want to change the Bezier curve that is added. So just go to edit mode and then it's already selected, but if it's not, or if you by accident select outside, just hit A to select all and then X to delete all vertices, and then choose the draw tool over here. Go to view, viewpoint, and then front view, or just hit 1 if you have the settings for emulating numpad turned on, or if you have an actual numpad, then you can just use the one on there, and then just draw. I like to draw a curve with a lot of loops, and then I can just go to select over here and start to adjust it. But you won't notice the adjustment you're making, or you won't know exactly how far you need to adjust this until you actually bevel it. So just go to the curve properties or the object data properties, how Blender likes to call it, and then go to geometry and then add some depth down here. Mine is blue because I have the face orientation turned on, just because I need to make sure that the outside is all blue and not red. Because when it comes to adding textures or materials later, you'll understand how that affects your design or your textures on your object. For now, we can just remove it. We're still in edit mode. I didn't hit tab again or click the tab key on the keyboard. If I click it, then we're in object mode. I cannot really edit the curve unless I go into edit mode. So I can just move it with G and then move it anywhere, or I can specify that I want to move it only on the y-axis. Do the same for this one, G to move or to grab, basically, from what we figured out from the first tutorial, and then Y to move it to the front. I also have proportional editing turned on the top over here, and if you have it turned on, then you can just hit G to move, but now you're going to see that only this point is moving. If I scroll up and down, whether you have a Mac Magic Mouse or a normal mouse with a wheel on the center, you can just move it up and down. It works either way. And now I'm actually moving the other points with it. So that's what's so cool about proportional editing. If I want to move something, but I also want to affect the points around it, then I can just define how far away from this point the other points are affected. And now I can actually have something that is more natural, rather than just editing point by point. And then if I click on this one, G, and then on the y-axis, just adjust the perimeter of the editing. And usually with draw or with the pencil tool over here, you get 2 points that are very close to each other. It's very similar to the pencil tool in Illustrator. So I can just click on that point and delete with X, delete vertices, and now I have a cleaner edge over here. And if you see something that looks a little weird over here, then you can just rotate it until you get something that is cleaner, and you can move this so it works nicely. And the same goes for here. This is not scaled enough for the bevel to work, so there's a little bit of clamping. And voila, I actually have a curve that I can work with. And if you want to fill the caps of the edges of this curve, then you can just fill cap from the bevel menu over here, and you have a solid curve start to end. Now, the reason why I went back to the bevel tutorial is to show you a very important tool that I haven't used in that tutorial. So if I go back to edit mode, I can adjust the radius for each of the points that are selected. So if I select this point, and this is exactly similar to the one in Illustrator, the width tool. If you select any of the points and then just drag, you can make it thicker. So let's say I want to select this point, and then I just go up and down and select how this curve is going to look, or how the depth is being affected for each of the points. Or if I undo this, I can just hit Option S or Alt S on a Windows, select all first, and then just go back to select over here, and then Option S, and I can just adjust the width of this line. So this is another way to add more dimension to your bevel without increasing the depth over here, but there has to be some value in the depth in your bevel settings. So if I had this at 0, then this width, whatever you're adjusting for the radius of each point over here, is not going to take effect until you actually have some geometry on your lines. So if I hit Shift and then add some geometry and then hit Option S, I can adjust the width of the curve. So yeah, that's the only thing that I use often that I haven't talked about in the bevel edges and vertices tutorial. So I decided to just keep it for the curves tutorial. Now, like I mentioned in the previous tutorial, this is what I use to create wires and tubes or anything that is basically a cylinder on a curve. So anything that you see in real life that is a shape of a cylinder but is more malleable, you can use this for. I only say ropes, wires, and tubes because that's what I use the majority of the time. You can even create pipes. I don't really know all of the uses for it. Maybe you have something that I haven't thought of, or just graphics that you want to add to your logo, let's say, that you want to create in Blender. Okay, now let's talk about another use for curves that I use often, that I used just recently in a post on Instagram, and that is using this curve as a path for other objects. So if I remove the bevel, just take it back to 0. I don't really need any geometry for it. I don't need to render it out. I just need an object to follow the path that I create. So I can just add any mesh. You can also add another curve if you like, bevel it or add some geometry to it with extrude, and then you can loop it around this curve. So if I go and choose torus, let's say, and the same goes for torus with the shrink and fatten or with the radius for each point, I can just hit Option S and then just shrink it or increase the width of each of the points. But because I don't actually have points over here because it's not a curve, then it's doing something else. It's shrinking and fatten, and I think that's what the tool is called. That's the tool. And then let's go out of edit mode. And every time I'm going into edit mode, just note that I'm hitting the tab key on the keyboard. And now if I right click and shade smooth, it should be smooth. And if I go to top view, and I like to edit my scales in edit mode because it doesn't affect the scale over here. So if I scale this on the x-axis, let's say, it does affect the scale of x over here. But if I undo this and then hit edit mode and then I scale it on the x-axis, it doesn't really affect the scale of the object itself. Almost everything in edit mode, I think, is unadjustable later. So if I scale it like this and then go out, it doesn't really show me how much I scaled it down on the x-axis, and so I cannot really go back to it. So if you know that you want to edit it later, then you can do this. But the problem with scaling over here or scaling rotation and changing the location of each object outside over here is going to affect some of the modifiers that you add. So you have to reset the scale and rotation especially in order for things to work correctly, because it needs the rotation to be 0 and sometimes it needs the location also to be 0 and the scale to be 1 for it to work properly. And that's why I usually scale things or change its location and rotation inside of edit mode so I don't need to reset or get into any problems later on if I want to add modifiers. The same goes with following a curve. If you have this not zeroed out or the scale reset to 1, then you'll find that your object is not going to follow the curve perfectly. And let's also scale it down on all axes. I still have the proportional editing turned on, so I can just turn it off. So it doesn't really create problems if I want to select part of it. Let's also scale it down a little bit more. Now that I have my object, I can go to the modifiers tab, add a modifier curve from the deform list, and then choose the curve object. The curve object is going to be your path. So I can just use the dropper to select, or I can use the menu over here. I like the dropper tool, and sometimes I like to select it from here if I had a lot of objects. And now I already have this following the curve. So if I move this right now with G and then maybe on the x-axis, I can actually see it deforming and following the path. Let's bring it back to 0. And now let's add an array. But let's put it before the curve because I want the entire array of objects to follow the curve, not just the first one. Because if I have it afterward right now and I increase the number over here, it's just going to follow whatever this is doing. And it's not going to follow the curve. But if I add it before the curve, then it's basically me saying, oh, whatever amount of shape I have already, then just curve it afterwards. So if you find something that isn't working, just check your modifier stack and change the position of each one to see if that works. And just think about the logic of it all. With the array modifier, you have a lot of ways to offset your object. I choose relative offset the majority of the time. I only use constant offset if I'm talking architectural stuff where I need an exact number to move by. So it works with meters. That's why I said architectural. I just did my dad's office floor layout and I had to use constant offset with the array modifier in order to actually specify the exact width and length of the tiles to lay it out perfectly so we know exactly how many tiles we need and how they're going to fit in the room. But if I'm working with just object for a digital export, then the relative offset is going to work fine. And usually a factor of 1 on any of the axes is going to work fine. And the more I add, the more it's going to follow the curve. But it can also go outward and it's going to go beyond the line following the natural curve of your path. So if I go further, it's just going to go on a straight line following the last point's curve. So I'll just stop at 36 maybe. And now if I want to reduce the factor over here, so I make them overlap, and always hit shift with these because the points are too big for some of the objects since our objects are really small. And now we have something that resembles a chain or some of these old 90s necklaces, the elastic black ones. You can also add another object, which is what I did with the necklace, to actually create the shape of 2 overlapping hoops in a necklace and then just multiplying it with the array and then making it follow the curve. And of course, the less the factor is, or the more packed your objects are, the more you're gonna need to fill the curve. Let's hide this and do something else. One of my favorite things as well when it comes to curves, and one that I talked about in Adobe Illustrator, and that is moving a curve around itself to create mesh or to create objects like a water bottle or a vase, anything that is round that has the same profile all around. And I mentioned previously in the Adobe Illustrator to Blender tutorial that I'm going to show you one day how to do that, and this is the perfect time for it because I usually use it with curves. So if I add a curve, but this time instead of adding a bezier, I'm going to add a circle. And then going from the top view, you can go to view, viewpoint, top, or just 7. Go into edit mode with tab and then scale it on the x-axis. You can also select this point and then scale it down. Select all of it, rotate it on the x-axis, so R, X, and then 90. So now it's facing the front because I rotated around the x-axis by 90 degrees. Now let's make it smaller. And if I go to the modifiers tab, I can go to screw, and we already have a shape. And how you add some space in the center is by hitting G to grab it and move it, and then X to move it on the x-axis. But again, like I said before, this is going to create a lot of problems in the modifiers tab or with any of the modifiers because I moved it in object mode and so it changed this. So you can either undo the movement or just hit Command A or Control A on a Windows and then apply the location and this will work. But I hate applying transformation. A better thing to do is just to move it in edit mode. So I can just undo this, undo again, and then go into edit mode. And if you want to see the curve, you can just remove this, which is showing whatever is in the modifiers tab in edit mode. Some of these are turned on automatically by default, and some of them are not. I think it depends on how heavy the modifier is. With screw, it's turned on automatically, so I can just remove it. And now whenever I'm in edit mode, it's not showing the screw modifier, but if I'm in object mode, it actually is visible. So I can just go into edit mode and then move it on the x-axis a little bit until the edge of it is on the center. Go out of edit mode and voila, you actually have something that kind of resembles an apple. And now the more I move it to the side, and if you want to see what's happening, you can just toggle this in edit mode and you can just move it now and see it in real time. And this time I already created the thumbnail, so I'll just show you later how I use this in my thumbnail. And if you want to do the same thing that I did in Illustrator, you can just adjust the angle. So it's not just rotated 360 degrees, so a full circle. You can just do a part of it. And with the screw offset, it basically moves the angle or the rotation around the center along the axis that you set. So if it's on the z-axis, then this movement is going to go upward or downward, depending on it being a positive value or a negative value. And then I can just hit shift and go upward. And now if I go like a full rotation or something like this, I can get an interesting shape. And finally, if I wanted to repeat this rotation, I can just increase the iteration. So it'll repeat the exact same thing from the angle and the screw offset, the amount of times that you ask it to. So it's kind of like a loop basically. And the axis is going to change how this is rotating. So right now it's rotating around the z-axis, but if you want it to rotate around the x-axis, you can just hit X, and the same for Y. And it'll change based on how your shape is in relation to the axis. So right now it's next to the y-axis, so it's going to rotate differently from the x-axis because it's facing it rather than sitting next to it. And with the z-axis, which is usually what I use, and that's why I think it's the default, because that's the majority of how it's used. And then if you move this anywhere else, it's going to change. But if I don't want it to change like this, I can specify an axis object, and this is where empties come in. So if I add an empty and just choose whatever shape you think is easier for you to find, I just use the plain axis, which is the default, and I can go to the shape and then choose empty as the axis object. And now this is going to be my center. So if I move it over here, depending on where the empty is in relation to the object that I'm trying to loop around itself, the shape is going to change. So if you have this away from the center and you want to add it with the other objects, so the best solution for something that you want to move away from the center is to add an empty and choose where you want it to sit next to your object in order to get the shape that you want without having your object stuck to the center or applying the modifier even. Because the only way you can move this without changing its shape is by applying the modifier. So if I just undo all of this, I can get back to my original. And the rest I don't really use, so we're not going to talk about it here. And that's the most important thing using curves with the screw modifier. Also note that the modifiers for curves are limited compared to mesh. If I remove this right now and I convert this to mesh, I get more modifiers to use with it. But if I undo this and we go back to curve, the modifier list is exactly what you would use with curves. And if I wanted to create, let's say, a vase with an opening in the center, then I can just delete this. But let's just hide it and add another curve. Now a bezier this time. Go into edit mode, hit X to delete all, and then again front view and choose the pencil to draw. And you can just create the vase curve. Like, how do you want your vase's profile to look like? So let's say I want something that looks like this. The only thing you need to know with a curve with vases or anything with an opening, like a water bottle or a vase like I'm doing right now, is when you want an opening, you can just move it outside how you want the vase to look like, how you want the vase's opening to look like. And then the points that you want closed, you can just move to the center. So now you ensure that it's closed from the bottom side. Then just adjust this so it sits on the line. And now that I have this, I can go to the screw modifier, And voila, I have an opened vase. And you can also add a subdivision surface to make it smoother. And you can still adjust the curve how you see fit. So let's say I think the opening is too big. I can just make it smaller. One of the biggest mistakes to do is to edit curves without being on a specific view. I like to be in front view because whenever I forget and do this, I find that my final result looks a little weird. And then when I go to the side, I realize that I've moved it without being on a front view or a side view. And so it just moved to a weird position. Let's just close this further. And you see there is a very small lip over here that goes outward that we can just adjust by fixing the rotation with R like usual. Also with this, you can just adjust the rotation. And because this is so much longer, the curve is nicer here, but it's very sharp over here. We can just move this like that. Same goes for this. You can just adjust the curve, control points to move with the movement of the vase. If you want to move the two control points together, you can just hit the center point and then scale it up and down. And that way I have a uniform scaling for both of them. Sometimes I have one that is shorter. That happens all the time when I use the pencil tool. It gives you the general shape, but the majority of the time it ruins the curves control points and it goes all over the place because it tries to follow the movement of your drawing. So you can just adjust that later on and it works fine. Okay, now one thing you'll notice is that the edge is too thin. So you can just go to solidify. You can go right before the subdivision surface. But just note that because you have curves, if I go into edit mode and I just remove the screw modifier view from the edit mode view, you can see that solidify is creating a very strange shape. So the more thickness you add, the stranger it's going to look at certain points because it doesn't really offset evenly. And if I add even thickness, it doesn't really work that well. So I just remove this and then just make sure that it's a very small value that just adds some geometry to it. Also with the screw modifier, one thing to note is that sometimes it rotating from the wrong normal facing outward. So if I go to face orientation and everything is blue, then we're fine. But the reason why right now is all blue from the inside and outside is because of the solidify modifier. So if I remove this, you can see the inside is red. Now, if you move this on the negative axis or using negative angles, like negative 360, you're going to see that the red side is going outward. Sometimes if you're using objects specifically rather than curves and your normal is, let's say, on that side and then you're rotating it, the normal is going to be outward. So just make sure that you either rotate so the blue side is facing you, or by adding the solidify, you can just fix that. And yeah, now we can just remove face orientation and we have a vase. Okay, so now let's go to the thumbnail so I can explain how I did everything on there. Let's start with the simplest one, and that is those hearts. I just drew the hearts with the pencil tool, edited all of the points, and added some bevel over here. Very simple, very easy to do. And then the next one is creating this chain. But instead of creating one part of the chain, one going forward and the other rotating so it fits inside of this loop, I created two different ones and then I changed the offset in the array. So let's actually deactivate all of the modifiers. If I deactivate the curve and the array, you can actually see the shape over here on its own. I simply added an array modifier to it. And now I have 28 ones. And I offset it on the y-axis just because my curve is going from up down or the opposite. And then I added a curve and the curve modifier and I deformed it on the z-axis because it's going from top to bottom. So that's the z-axis. Oh, and actually I don't really know why for the array modifier, the y is going upward and then the z is going where the y is going, so front and back. But with anything that has a different axis to move along or to curve on, for the deform axis over here on the curve, I just test it out and I see what works. I've also seen multiple tutorials where people said just to go and loop through all of them and see what works for you. And if I turned on the curve, now it's working the way I need it. And then I moved this until it fit with the other one. So if I actually remove this and the array and curve for the other one, they're on top of each other. Like you cannot see it because of this. You can actually see that I created the chain shape. And then when I added the array for each one of them, it created the chain. And then when I added the curve for each one, like it followed the curve after following what the array modifier and the location of each of them was doing. So a little bit of adjustments here and there, and I created a chain. This is not what I did with my notes on an execution pendant. I did create the two together and join them, and then I added an array modifier for them as a joined object, and then the curve. But that technique is a little iffy because this deforms the object or the shape of your objects. So if there is a very tight loop at a certain point on your curve, then you're going to actually see a deformation in your objects. And because I had two objects, I had a lot of deformation at certain points, but because it was really small, I didn't really care that much. But here, because this is the focal point of this thumbnail, this is one of the focal points of this thumbnail, I had to actually make sure that it didn't deform. So having the loop that is facing forward alone and then the other one on its own, it makes for a smoother curve without that much deformation. Because if you look over here, there is a little bit of deformation that you cannot necessarily see very well in the final result, but the bigger or the closer you are to the curve, you're going to see it more. And then for this one, I did a similar thing to what I did with the screw modifier that created a shape that looked more like a shell. So if I remove all of the modifiers from this one, let's actually just separate it. And then if I remove all of these, you can actually see the shape of it. This is how it looks like. Like I was planning on creating a phone wire, like an old phone wire, but I wasn't planning on this shape being it in the end. But because it worked out, I just left it. But if I were to just focus on this shape, I would just adjust the curve down here. But I wanted to use a nurb instead of a curve just to have something on there that uses a nurb. I never really use them, but you can go to curve and then a nurb curve or a nurb circle. And the only difference is that it creates a curve naturally. So this point is kind of like a control point, a joint control point for this part of the curve. And however you move it, it's going to curve naturally until it hits the other point. So if you want a perfect curve without editing too much, then a nurb is what you're going to need, if that's what it's called. So that's why the shape is a little different. I just wanted to use that in my project because I always just use curves. And now let's go from the beginning of the stack because the modifier stacks goes downward. So if I add the screw modifier, I have the initial shape and I moved this outward a little so it gives me a bigger rotation. So I have more of a wire or a phone wire shape. And then I increase the screw offset on the z-axis, of course, because this is where it is. And then I also added a center or an empty so I can just move it away from the center. And then I added 54 iterations. And this is basically what we did with the array for the chain. The iteration is added until I fit the shape onto the curve. And then I added solidify modifier just because the edges show. And if I don't add the solidify modifier, it's going to look weird in the final result. So I just added a little bit of geometry around the curve. And then I curved it around the curve I drew. And I added more loops to this curve. And finally, a subdivision surface, just because some of the deformation over here was too harsh. So if you look at it with the subdivision without, you're going to see the difference. And let's hit the slash key so we can actually see it with everything else. And finally, this rose. And because I'm listening to Rouge right now by Mona Awad, I'm creating this rose for it. Like I said, my thumbnails are inspired by the books I'm reading or I plan to read in September because these posts are going to be uploaded in September. With this, I already applied the modifier, but I added a curve, like a circular curve, and then I added the screw modifier to rotate it around itself. And now I have like a closed shape, but because it was a round shape, it didn't move like it didn't mimic the vase, for instance, where the opening is actually opening to the inside of the mesh. And I had to apply it because I wanted to add some shape to it here in the center and also to raise some of the edges over here so it looks more like a flower. And then I added this stem and leaves. And yeah, with the shading, this is how it looks. I made this a little bit transparent to mimic the flower on the cover of Fruge. And then I don't have any rhyme or reason for the other colors. I just choose whatever I think fits well with the other thumbnails and fits well with the shapes themselves. And the Curves and Nurbs text is just an SVG, which is basically a curve that I extruded and then added the cloth modifier to it with some pinning so it looks more like a stitched text. Yeah, that's pretty much all you need to know about Curves and Nurbs when it comes to my workflow. And as always, I'll talk to you soon. Bye!